There are a couple of questions that have been asked. The first one, which it's open to either of you to answer, is how do you think blockchain technology has or will impact traceability and packaging? It's an easy question, so no problems.
Well, I'm going to say it's absolutely critical. I mean, I think that it can add enhanced value and measurement and tracking and trace. And I think that most businesses should already have it. And if they don't, they're probably behind the 8 ball on it. It's really important for them to have it. Pierre.
There is some work already being done on blockchain in this space. I'm not really up to date with the blockchain technology, other than to say I know that folk around the world are involved in it and are working on it in cold supply chain.
Thank you. There's Pierre, before you go too far, there's a specific question for you, which is, can you explain why traceability might not occur during transport and globally? And if you could pick one thing to improve it, what would you do?
Okay, there are 2 parts to that question. The first part in the question is, great question. I ask the same, and I'm sure that Mark Mitchell would ask the same question as well. Why not? But we know from hands-on, we know it's not happening. And we're not only looking at Australia. From a global perspective, it's simply not happening. Hence why I told you early in the presentation, a figure of $14 billion every year is lost in pharma alone. How should we improve it? I think it's an understanding. There's a lack of technology understanding, number one. Number two, the apparatus, the equipment, the technology is all there. It simply is not being implemented. So all that they have to do is spend some of that 14 million in pharma, now I'm referring to, on putting in the systems to be able to control it. It's not a rocket science solution, because the technology is available. Whether it's available in all countries, that's debatable. There are a lot of developing countries where it's not, we understand that. Certainly, from an Australian perspective, there should be no reason why they do not implement it.
Cool, thank you. One for you, Nerida, based on some of the examples you have, is particularly for some of those packaging examples, the innovation ones, the question is, how adaptable or affordable are these options for bulk packaging as opposed to smaller packs?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And look, the value of the cost of the solutions will be determined by the value of your product. So of course, there's going to be lower value products that it may be too cost prohibitive for, but if you're looking at more premium products, then I would highly recommend it. So it's really going to depend on your product as to whether you can get the total cost of ownership. But they are not as expensive as they used to be either, and I'm sure there's plenty of suppliers online today that would agree, and I'm sure all of them would be more than happy to have those conversations and make sure they're very affordable, because we do need some of these technologies on our packaging, we really do.
Just as an add-on to that, something that's been in my airspace for the last couple of weeks is this type of pack for liquid products as opposed to dry products. Do you know of examples where they exist for cold chain solutions for liquid products or products that are in liquid?
In which type of pack, Barry?
For example, some of like the last one that you showed, which was not for, which wasn't a food example, but it was the
vaccine,
the farm. Yeah. So if somebody's putting, I don't know, if they're putting live abalone in seawater at -1 degrees to ship it as a live option, do those sort of things exist?
Yeah, you're an expert in that.
Yeah, the answer is yes, which is fantastic. Obviously, it's a special design type of packaging. It's not your standard type packaging, but absolutely. Wet products, being exported to China, not as much now, but certainly in the past, with no to little issues. So quite doable.
Right. And the last question in our remaining 2 minutes is, what about blockchain is so critical?
Just repeat that question. What
is it about blockchain that makes it so critical?
No, I don't want to profess to know about the ins and outs of blockchain. Maybe Mark will touch on that in his presentation.
We will keep that. Hold that one over.
Let's leave that one for Mark. He'd be more than happy to answer that one.
I'm sure he will. All right. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Nerida, for your presentations and for answering the questions.
Thanks, Maren.
Great to have you part of our sessions today. We're going to have a bit of a change of pace and a change of format and move to a panel session now, where we're going to have a look at, get some insights into the Australian context a little bit more deeply. And I'm joined today by 4 panelists. The first is Mark Mitchell, and Mark is the chair of Supercool Group of companies, and they operate globally, and they're a mobile air conditioning equipment, transport, refrigeration, compressor, design and refrigeration manufacturing company. In 2017, Mark helped form the Australian Food Cold Chain Council and is the current chairman. And he is an expert in his field and valued by many authorities, among them the Australian government, and has been the representative of Australia in Brussels for Australia at the Global Forum on Mobile Air Conditioning. Joining Mark on the panel today is Carolyn Cameron, who is the Sector Action Plan Lead with Stop Food Waste Australia, and who is working with industry and associations like the Australian Food Cold Chain Council to co-design strategies to reduce food waste and capture its value. Carolyn has over 40 years experience in environmental and strategic planning, having worked with mining, universities, state governments, national governments for some time. And in 2018, Carolyn was appointed as General Manager of Food Sustainability with Food and Agribusiness Growth Sector to lead the implementation of the National Food Waste Strategy. Carolyn is joined by Eric, who is from the Sydney Fish Markets and has been there for 16 years, with half his time that in quality assurance and the other half in supplier account management and business development. And prior to the Sydney Fish Markets, he was the commercial skipper on 5 fishing industries. I would like to know what he's like in a tropical storm. He's probably got great sea legs. In his current role, he's the Innovation and Technical Manager for the Sydney Fish Markets that allows him to develop standards and streamlining of operations for the Sydney Fish Markets. And last but not least, for the panel, we have David, who we introduced earlier, and to help us with this session. So we're going to ask Pierre a question first. And that is, Pierre, if we take a global view, and then we'll come back to Australia, how would you say Australia rates overall? What are the things we're doing really well in cold chain management from a global perspective? Give us a bit of a comparison, please.
It's not a simple, straightforward answer. And I want to start off by saying that in the global market in packaging, we in Australia don't always like to hear this. So I prefer not to be asked the question, because we are so insignificant in the global scene. We don't even make up 0.5% of global packaging. In fact, the figure is 0.3. So the net result is that, you know, in our space here, we think we play an important role. But on the global market, the guys up in Europe and so on, Americas, they don't worry too much with what's happening. So that's the precursor to what I'm going to say next regarding how well are we doing in the cold supply chain. And I'd like to hear Mark's version of this later on, because he's very right up there in it all the time. Having said that, we lose a lot of product in our cold supply chain. And in the earlier slides that I had, that temperature range fluctuation where we're breaching the temperatures. That is a major problem, simply because we have a number of logistical ownership happening. The ownership is transferred from the start to the finish. 30 years ago, that was not so. We use one logistical company to move the product from the start to the finish. That's no longer the case. And so that responsibility factor is not being maintained. So, Mark's right there. I would say that, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, and Mark, shoot me down if I'm wrong, I reckon we're around about 5 out of 10.
Well, that depends, Pierre. That depends. As Pierre said, there's a lot of, there's a big change in the amount of cohorts and actors in the cold chain now. It's really changed it dramatically in the last 15 to 20 years. It's a very fast, particularly in Australia, it's a fast cold chain now. It's a long cold chain. And of course, it's very hot as well. We live in one of the driest and hottest continents in the world. So operating the cold chain, the modern cold chain, is a hard gig for everyone, for sure. So, you know, I can, Barry, do you want me to move on to commenting about the broader issues in Australia?
Yeah, I guess that's a great segue into actually making some comments around that.
Yeah.
And just noting, if people do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function and we'll pick them up as we go along.
Great, thanks, Barry. Yeah, so look, as I was saying earlier, it's there's many facets to the cold chain. It's a very, very complex little diamond. But look, there's a couple of significant things to say about the modern cold chain and as it sits currently in Australia. And the first thing we have to recognise that there are three main sectors or key activities within the modern cold chain. And these are contained within refrigeration systems, number one, number two, storage and transport assets, and number three, process and management systems. And it's with great regret and frustration that across the broader cold chain, there's an enormous disconnect between these three sectors to enable a true, connected and compliant cold chain to operate. And look, this comment is not meant to dilute the good work of the few compliant cold chains in Australia and the great work of the people working in them. But I have to say the majority are broken and non-compliant due to the lack of cohesion between these three sectors. And the result is the lack of right behaviour. It's the lack of the right language within the industry about cold chain, the lack of language about cold chain training, cold chain practitioners, and cold chain principles. The second point to say is that there is, which is most sadly lacking, is within the third point in those three sectors, which is within the process. The majority of cohorts in the cold chain fail, in all the food supply chain, failed to deliver, adopt, or even recognise the cold chain processes as quality management systems. And this points to the cold chain, the blockchain question that came up earlier. This is a significant point because if you fail to adopt your cold chain process as a QMS, a quality management system, you will fail to verify quality at the different steps in the system. So you end up being one of those poor souls that thinks by having a cold truck or a cold shed with cold food inside it, that you're in the cold chain. Nothing could be further from reality. Compliant cold chain facility or transport is one that recognises trained cold chain practitioners, that has verified the temperature of incoming goods, monitors the same goods whilst they're in possession of that facility or transport, and verifies the temperature of the goods during the outgoing intervals, and is prepared to be and this is the key point. This is where blockchain can ultimately play play a role in the long term. And that facility or transport or cohort or actor is prepared to be transparent with all the temperatures incoming, during storage and outgoing to all stakeholders when the change of custody occurs. That's a cold chain. And it's with absolute urgency that the industry must focus on this point, which no doubt Eric knows in the commercial fish business, no doubt, Eric.
Yes, it's a very relevant issue for us, particularly because we've got a highly perishable product that is going through multiple different hands and different levels of sophistication. So, case in point, we have a transporter that runs down the eastern seaboard all the way from Cairns to us in Sydney. This carrier carries mainly chilled fish, but towards the end of the journey, some of the New South Wales producers put on live seafood. Now, officially, they're supposed to board up the back of the truck to prevent the cold air from affecting the live products too much. Now, historically, this operator, as they got closer to Sydney and picked up the live products, some truck drivers would agree to the fisher's request and turn up the aircon a little bit just to make sure that the product in the back wasn't affected. Now that the producers are requesting a bit more transparency of that cold chain, and these trucks are obviously tracked by GPS and the temperatures are known. And so now we've got the live guys complaining that their products are being affected because the truck drivers are turning the temperature back down to keep the chilled products within spec. So it's a tricky one, and I guess that's where packaging is, very important, because I've been banging on to these live guys for years that they need to do more than just throw the product in a box. Avocados come in trays, and nashi bears have wrappings around them, and these are $60, $70 products that they're tipping into a box and sending to us. So I think that's paramount. I'll just make one comment about the blockchain piece, because we've recently completed a project, Food Agility CRC project, that included a blockchain component. I was actually least excited about that component because, any blockchain it's a data integrity, but if you put rubbish data in, you're going to get rubbish data out. So it's more paramount to have the traceability tech, whether it's, trackable devices, temperature readers, for example, like we looked at, image recognition software for grading of our fish. All that data is what's important, I think. And not to underwrite sort of blockchain, but I think, those other components are, vital. And there's that lack of sort of transparency through the chain, I think, more technology wise than anything else.
Yeah, it's got to start there.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
So a question to both of you is, you've raised the question of disconnection and differences of opinions about what is needed, what is not needed. How much of our challenge is human and our inbuilt preference for behaviour versus a lack of understanding of how to use technology?
Yeah, well, yeah, the principally, Barry, if I can say, the lack of cohesion is generally driven by commercial forces. So commercially, the cold chain industry hasn't got its act together, if you like. All the different cohorts and actors in it are driven by market forces to behave in a certain way. It's changing gradually. It gets better each year and each month. I think we progress by a couple of millimetres, but we need to elevate the quality agenda and the quality management system into the cold chain. So it's sort of meeting of the forces, commercial forces, and then there's the quality management. And I know I keep repeating myself on that, but that's essentially what must happen. And all the tools that we have, the data loggers and the blockchain and temperature recorders and probes and barriers in trucks and different packaging, the wonderful packaging that Nerida and Pierre have just told us about, they have all got to become part of a QMS called the cold chain.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily that people don't want to do it. I think a lot of people just don't have the tools. We, right through COVID, this has been sort of highlighted with our buyer base, because we all of a sudden were restricted from having 160 buyers in the auction hall bidding electronically down to about 50. So all the rest took up our online bidding system, which had been sitting idle for the past sort of 6 or so years. No one ever used before. And all of a sudden, because they were forced to do it, everyone started learning how to use laptops. So people who had pen and paper before, because they had to make that transition, they did. And I think, that comes down to, that transparency through the chain. Like we track one up, one down in our QMS, but with a slight tweak to some of our technology, we could actually go further than that. Every supplier that we have can put barcodes on their product. In fact, a majority of them do now. So there's no reason why we can't track further than that.
All right, thank you. We'll just have continuing the overall themes. We've heard from Mark about some commentary on where we sit in Australia, and from Pierre about our global. We've heard from Eric a little bit about the one individual supply chain, but Nerida also and Pierre both mentioned food loss as one of the key imperatives of cold chain and packaging. And so I want to ask Carol and Cameron, who, in your experience with looking at food loss across Australia, what's the impact of cold chain on food loss, food waste, and food safety?
Thanks, Barry. It's amazing, really, what it does. And the thing about food waste is that the cold chain may have an impact that you don't know until you get it to the store. You get it to your house, you put it in your fridge, and then suddenly the strawberries are moldy and you wonder why you only bought them 2 days ago. But that was because they weren't handled properly in the cold chain. And that poor temperature management with fresh food often contributes to food loss and waste. So some products like mangoes, because of the nature of where they grow and the extent of the cold chain, in Australia might go through 14 different places where they are taken from a truck, put on a dock, put into something that's a different temperature, back and forth and back and forth. And it has contributed considerable amounts to overall food waste. So the study I'll talk about is probably the most relevant one. Was Refrigerants Australia did some work a couple years ago. And they looked at the total cost and where the food waste occurred within the system. So it ended up to be $3.8 billion of farm gate that was wasted. 25% of all fruit and veg, $3 billion is wasted. That might not be the waste at, when you're taking it off the truck at the last stage. It might be, again, in home. But looking at it, and probably the reason, if you go through a bit of an explanation of why that would be as such, fruit and veg are less controlled with traceability, with food safety with the controls that we have on meat and dairy and seafood. So it probably is the product that is loved the least, perhaps, and the least attention paid to it. But the loss in meat and seafood was the 700 million. So it's not insubstantial at all. So what are we doing about it? You know, no point in sitting here going, oh, my dear, and wringing our hands. Let's look. So Stop Food Waste Australia has been working very closely with Mark and the team at AFCCC, and we've developed what we call a sector action plan, and it takes into consideration the things we've been talking about today. It looks at some of the opportunities for process improvement, but knowing there's the people aspect that go with it as well. So getting that understanding of creating a food code and using that to give better food handling, better accurate measurements of temperatures. Amazing how many people don't know how to use a thermometer. You know, something as basic as how to use the thermometer. And then getting that cohesion and monitoring at all steps in the cold chain, that quality system, that understanding the custody of documentation that needs to occur. It's something that we really need to think about. The emissions that come with the food waste is higher than the emissions from the trucks and the cold chain and the refrigerators and everything. So it's not just the impact of the dollars and the tonnages of food waste, it's also the greenhouse gas and other things that goes with it. So we have an imperative, and Stop Food Waste Australia is working with organizations like the AFCCC, but also with other companies, and they'll start to then zero in on the companies and then kind of take a pincer movement and make sure that that can get addressed from both angles. It's been a pleasure working with Mark. So Stop Food Waste Australia is a partnership with state and territory governments and the national government and a number of organizations like the AFCCC. What do you think the role, Mark, is for governments? Are they doing enough about cold chain and its impacts on things like food waste, greenhouse gas, other things?
Thanks, Caroline. Yes, Carol, I think yes, the government is really pulling on the oar now. Perhaps in the past not, but certainly, as you know, there's great dialogue and great communication on the topic now. I think the biggest thing that is happening right now, and the biggest thing that we want, is some help from the government to put in a regime that allows the cold chain to rise above all the other laws and regulations and codes of conduct and all the obligations that cohorts in the cold chain have to adhere to every day, and have that defined as a single activity. And I'm principally talking about a national code of conduct or national code of practice for the handling of fresh produce in the cold chain in Australia. Now, such a document I want to be driven by industry, or certainly prepared by industry, and then with some assistance via regulation. We have this, Caroline and her team are working on this wonderful Australian Food Pact idea. Well, it's more than an idea, it's a really great plan now. And that is a way that we can instrument a national code of conduct for the cold chain. And if we can do that, so if we can prepare such a code for industry, by industry, and then have the government give us a tailwind and have it written in as a national initiative. This is the key. It's got to be a national initiative. That's the It's almost as important as the code itself. It has to be national. It can't be state by state. It'll drive us nuts. So national agenda and a national code of conduct. I think that would be a great start. And when you get such a document, a lot of the cohorts and stakeholders in it will be able to see where they're compliant or not compliant. And such a code is not going to really ask people to do any more than what they're doing, other than change their process and turn what they're doing into a quality management system. So yeah, so that's, to me, that's the prize from a government point of view.
And $3.8 billion worth of food we save.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, I've left the food waste numbers and all that to you, Caroline. Yeah.
It's those sort of numbers really do give a commercial imperative to making changes. I mean, the $14 billion that Pierre talked about, which I want to pick up on a question that's in the Q&A, which is probably for Pierre, but there may be others that would like to comment. And that's, who leads in cold chain? Is it countries? Is it organization? Who looks after it? Who's in charge of creating these cold chain processes?
You know, Mike would probably be a better one to answer this question, but you know, you have associations like Mike and other ones around the world that obviously steer it. But you know, it has to be driven by some regulatory body. Mark, am I correct?
Yes, Pierre, of course. Not too much regulation, but to answer the question is, it's nobody. There's no single entity that drives the cold chain. It's an industry that's driven by separation. That's why I was very quick to say in my first point, the three key sectors in the cold chain are the refrigeration. There's the refrigeration sector, the storage and transport sector, and then there's processes and systems. And they've driven it through supply chain. So the cold chain is a layer that's developed over time because of the necessity to transport chilled products around the world. It's emerged in amongst supply and logistics. It needs defining. This is my point. This is what I'm saying. It needs to be defined as a QMS. It needs to have the right language. There needs to be the right language around cold chain practitioners and cold chain language. And it's gradually happening, but we have a lot of work to do within industry, and a little bit of help from government would be very welcome right now, globally, not just in Australia.
Thank you for those comments, gentlemen. I'm just going to some other questions that have come in, and one is there research that demonstrates whether on-pack temperature indicators for consumers to reduce food waste, or do they reduce food waste or not? And if there's a label indicator that the product is deteriorating, do consumers eat it quicker or throw it away quicker? Any comments from our learned experts?
I know Mike will come in as well. Sorry,
Carolyn probably got a comment to make.
Carolyn?
I was just going to say that the Fight Food Waste CRC is actually having a project right now about date labeling and working with people to see whether it makes a difference. You know, how do households make those choices when they see it? You know, do they give it the sniff test or do they look at the date? They're doing some work to determine that. But these guys probably have historic things as well that they're aware of. That this is the work for the CRC is underway right now.
But Carolyn, when will that work be completed?
It will be completed over the next 18 months. It's kind of a stage study, but okay. they're working through it right now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Barry, if I could just jump in as well. So the ARP are a part of that project, and it is really important that we have the science behind this and the research. And I don't believe there is adequate research at this moment, and we need more. And we are trying to encourage more intuitive packaging, active and intelligent packaging, but we need the research and the qualifications from the consumers. So this project is a really good one because it's an industry-led collaborative project.
And also add there, in my presentation, I was discussing time temperature indicators and again, the science behind it. When we've introduced those concepts across the world through the WPO, the immediate reaction of those folk that we are talking to, and I'm talking across the world, when they hear about these time temperature indicators, their immediate reaction is that's going to cause more food waste, simply because you have this temperature aspect changing a color code or color image. So if it was green, it changes to red, for example. And in between there's an amber, something like a traffic light. So if you come along there and you see it being amber, are you going to buy it, or are you going to buy one that's green still? Clearly, you won't buy the amber if you're looking at that indicator. Now, it's a little bit more pronounced because it's an image as opposed to a best before date. Now, many folk do look at a best before date before they buy, but many of us don't. You know, how many times you buy milk, you actually look at the expiry date? You don't really when you buy it. Whereas though in a graphic image like the TTIs, you would. And so it is an area of concern.
And a related question to that is adoption of TTIs hasn't been very high across the food industry. And the question is that because of cost? Is that because of lack of understanding or something else? I'm just interested in thoughts.
Okay, it's a one-word answer, cost.
That's very simple.
Well, yeah, I want to elaborate a lot more about it.
But yeah, no, it's a...
Around the world, in your developed countries, in the developing world, it's not being introduced. They simply do not have those funds for that sort of thing. And there's no short-term solution for that. And that's what's coming through very strongly across the world. In developed countries,
Pierre, it's not perfected technology yet, though, either, is it?
It's not what, Mark? Perfected
technology?
Yeah, some of them are, there are issues in terms of accuracy of it, whereas though a written best before date is far more accurate. So there is that issue. So people are reluctant to embark on it, knowing that potentially this thing could give you an incorrect reading and therefore increase your waste on food. So, and then you're paying more for it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question in our panel, and the question that's come in is, sorry, I'll get this right. Is there a world standard to verify temperature information for cold chain or best practice? And are governments enforcing these standards? I'm guessing, Mark, that might be something you would like to comment on.
The answer is yes. There's some great literature out there now for best storage temperature, best transport temperatures for various food products. It is a little bit of a patchwork arrangement globally. There are some differences between countries and how they charter their different codes of practice or their different food laws as it relates to different food temperatures. But the FAO has been doing some really great work in that area, and we've been really extracting that information in readiness for our own chart of recommended temperatures for storage and transport of all food products for the code that I was talking about earlier. So, and look, that's a great question, because at the end of the day, that's the elephant in the room. It's which product to carry at or store at which product over which time in which humidity. And that's really, really important information. It will be a crucial piece of the code of conduct that we're talking about.
Thank you for that comment, Mark. And thank you to both of our presenters, Pierre and Nerida. Thank you also to Carolyn, to Eric, for being part of the panel. There's been some interesting things that we have come across today. Just looking at some of the comments that I have taken down, one of the things that struck me is from all of our speakers is the complexity and yet the need for interoperability or interconnectedness of the cold chain supply. The almost atomization of individual handshakes and transaction of information between individual companies and individuals themselves all through the supply chain, whether it's a local supply chain or a global supply chain. And Eric was sharing an example of where there is a merged supply chain, even within just the fish markets for Sydney. So that complexity is one thing that has been highlighted. Mark and Pierre have both spoken about the need for quality standards, and some of the things that Nerida has shown us are ways in which those quality standards can be at least if not in practice from systems, but are visible to see whether those standards have been breached or not with some of the traceability, the indicator packaging that we have available. It's people as well as technology. So it's not just one solution. It's not just data. It's not just thermometers. It's people have got to be part of that conversation. And how do you bring everybody on the journey and yet keep everybody up to date with what's needed for technology?